I'm excited to have the opportunity to moderate this panel today about the grand design for Web3, and just to talk a little bit about where we can go from here. It's been a very busy year for Web3, with all sorts of ups and downs, to say the least. But for me to be a part of it has been super exciting because everything is being built right now and across so many different industries. And so I think we're in a position with this panel and the guests that we have today to really get many different perspectives on that because they're coming into this with all sorts of different experience and projects. So without further ado, we'll kick it off just by illuminating what it means to each of the people that are here to be a part of this ecosystem. And we're talking about a grand design. So I thought I would ask, what does a grand design mean to you? Arisa, you can go first.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. Very glad to be here today. I think for me, the grand design in Web3 really shows a paradigm shift in the way we describe and organize our current systems. And when I say systems, it's quite high level, but I think it could really apply to any industries. I think it can apply to the economic systems, the political systems, anything from supply chain management to even the way that we have our social network. This paradigm shift is based off of the whole idea of decentralization. And when we have a decentralized system, we're able to connect the worlds just as one. So there's less borders between different countries, different social economic systems. And then I think the aspect of decentralization also reduces operational cost and allows a velocity of information and a velocity of access across these various systems. And I'm really, really excited to see them being put in place little by little, starting from now.
Yeah, and Joey, I'm curious, what's your perspective on design in Web3?
Yeah, so for me, I think of it as important to think about architecture. And if you think about the reason the internet was originally and is still so successful is before then we had in telecom a monolithic telephone company that did the pipes, the fiber, the switches, and all the way up to the content. It was a slow-moving, lumbering structure. And what the internet did was it broke up it into layers. You've got Ethernet, TCP/IP, HTTP, and each of the layers was an open protocol that wasn't controlled by the government that allowed interoperability and then allowed competition at each layer. So you had the Ciscos and the 3Coms and the Amazons could all compete. And it's been marching up the layers, and blockchain is the next layer. And each time that you go, what happens is when we first made the internet, we had all bunch of independent ISPs, and we were trying to push the telephone companies out of business. But then they got the rug pulled by the financial markets, and they were acquired by the telephone companies, and it was decentralized, but then it got centralized again. And then when Web 2 first came out, when we started blogs, we were running on our own servers, you could download each other's, it was actually open. Web 2 at the beginning was open, and then the platforms came and made it easier, and the cloud came, and then it contracted again. And then kind of like breathing, it contracts and expands. So now we're on the third expansion, where we've got all these platforms, and then with blockchain, we see another massive decentralization. But the core sort of philosophy of the internet, I think, and the architecture of the internet is to have unbundled layers, so you don't have this top, like vertical integration, with open protocols and competition on the business side, but it's like a sandwich of open protocols and competition of competition. I think the biggest difference with blockchain is that the protocol layer actually is money. Before, protocol layers never had money, so that's a different thing. And I think we're starting to bump up into the political layer much harder. So the stakes are higher. But the architecture concepts are still the same. I think it's interoperability, accessibility, global. I think interoperability is really important. And I think one of the key thing I'm concerned about a little bit, not concerned, but what's different, another different thing, is by this point in the earlier sort of internet layer, we had already decided it was TCP/IP, but we haven't decided on the protocol layer right now. So there's some differences, but I think the fundamental philosophy is the same. But you don't get to design it, it emerges. So what's interesting is to look at the different protocols like Ethernet and TCP/IP. They weren't necessarily the best protocols, but they were the ones that were the easiest to use and proliferated the most. And so there's a competition right now at the blockchain protocol level, which is important, but we need to make sure that we try to keep the values. But I do think that there's always going to be a push to centralize again, because that's what money does. Like, money's lonely, it likes to go where other money is, and power likes to go where other power is. And there's this kind of breathing. And so my sort of design point is to try to get the values locked in as much as possible so that we get the benefit of the decentralized openness for as long as possible. Because I worry that with a lot of the KYC stuff like Tornado Cash issue, which we can talk about, a lot of the leadings, I see entrepreneurs who easily throw their design values out the window just because they're afraid of going to jail or they're afraid of not making enough money. And so to me, the design is going to be how can we keep some of the values that Arisa just talked about as we get into a tougher period, both from a regulatory perspective as well as a business perspective.
Yeah, it strikes me that you used to be able to think about design as something that was largely solved for you, and now it's like you're a participant, whether you like it or not. And it got me thinking about whether or not we ever will end up having something we chose, or if it just will be like this indefinitely, and if that's the new normal. So maybe we can talk more about that later. Micah, I know you've been thinking a lot about the space as it relates to people and how they interact with Web3 and sort of take care of their assets. So I'm interested in your perspective. What do you think design means in Web3?
Yeah, when I hear the term grand design, I immediately think about outer space and the universe we live in and how grand it is and how it is wild, how we are alive in the day-to-day, but more applicably to today's conversation. I think that what we're building right now is a foundation of what is going to be blockchain or whatever is built on blockchain a decade from now. But thinking more generationally, and each new technological innovation that shifts and shapes the way society moves, we've seen opportunities for it to improve or opportunities to kind of solidify structures that we've had in place before. And so with every iteration, I think blockchain, Web3, crypto is another iteration of that opportunity to improve upon or build or change the systems that we have today. And it's up to the entire ecosystem to build on that and make it better if that's where we want to go. I think just thinking purely, if you think about who built every single step of the way up, it's been humans, and who is building blockchain, it's humans again. So for the tendency for it to become more centralized, like Joy-san mentioned, is there. The opportunity for a better and decentralized future, like Arisa-san mentioned, is there. So with those things in mind, we're building for something more like that as well, but it's conversations like this that help shape and position the future for something better.
Thanks. Ken, so you are thinking a lot about how companies in this space interact with their employees and how employees interact with their companies. And there are real rules that have already been designed for hundreds of years around that. And I like to think of you as somebody who's kind of connecting Web3 and Web2 or Web 1, or maybe even just like the laws of reality with this space that's kind of so disconnected in so many ways. So I'm really curious to get your perspective on what design means in that context.
Yeah, I think everyone else really covered in like a really concise, easy to understand way, grand design for the whole space. But in terms of how I view connecting it to the real world, so to say, is that I think that like 99% of actually what's been designed by humans is actually good. It's really just figuring out that next 1% where everything is new in Web3. And I think the really unique thing is that with Web 2 versus Web 1 or Web 2 is that Web 3 puts the value in the hands of its stakeholders, and you can actually align all the stakeholders, be your customers, your vendors, your partners, your employees. And I think that over the long term, this can actually create a lot more stability because it's much more long-term focused, and the blockchain removes network effects, which is what Web 2 and I think a lot of centralization depends on. So I think we're in for some volatile times in the near term, but it's really exciting to see, for us to figure out, I think, with governments, how we bridge the gap. And I think a lot of that just has to be based on the foundations that already have been built, as you mentioned, over hundreds of years, and those aren't really going to change.
I guess that gives us a nice segue into another topic that's really important and it's top of mind for everybody in Web3 right now, which is what is the government's role to play in this new technology, and what part of the design should the government be responsible for? And I guess I'll just start going in a different direction. So Micah, what are your thoughts on this?
My thanks. I think government's role is to keep their citizens as safe as possible, like safe and happy. Let's make sure everyone has resources, has jobs. I think when it comes to technologies, it's tough for governments to fully understand the rapidness that things are moving forward and all of the possibilities that new technology can offer them. I think it takes decades for them to catch up or truly grasp what is possible. So that being said, I think they can do all that they can to keep those citizens safe and the country safe, whatever that means to them, while also giving their citizens and the future of their country the opportunity to leverage and utilize the new technologies that have been offered to them. So that's a lot that I'm saying all at once, but I think that ultimately governments have the right desire in their hearts for what they want to do with the future of their country and the regulations and whatever policies they decide to instill. But they do have to realize that they may not have the full picture of things and lean on those who do have better knowledge and good understanding as advisees or great voices on behalf of their country.
Arisa, I mean, I know what you're working on is something where this is a huge consideration. So is it something that you think every government has approached in a similar way, or what sort of approaches have you seen work best?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we think about government and regulation, we tend to overthink the formality of it. But at the end of the day, how I consider laws is basically rules. When you're a kid and you're at a school, your teachers give you rules so that, not because they want to control you, but it is because they want to open up a world to you that you haven't seen before, and also to keep you safe. They have rules that you can't, say, go out to a establishment right after school because they want to make sure you get home safely. In that same way, I think rules are important for Web3, but too much rules can really inhibit the growth and innovation of the space. And so I think it's really important, especially at this very nascent stage of the industry, to let the businesses that are building grow as fast and as largely as possible, and then really work with them closely in figuring out what are the bits that we need to control so that there are no bad actors in the environment, and people are able to de-risk themselves as much as possible. But when you are building with a lot of rules, that just creates something that is not as impactful. And so it's really a balance that I think we haven't really struck well yet, and everyone is figuring out the best practices for.
Ken, how have you seen when it comes to something like a payroll or the types of laws that are so well defined? Is there an opportunity to innovate, and how do you take these new concepts and help the government understand them in a way where really your goal is to help every company be doing this in a way where governments are actually excited and on board?
Sure. I kind of see two worlds here, actually. There's the Web3 companies and the governments that want to work together. And then there's the Web3 companies there's the Web3 companies that want to follow, all the kind of laws that work. And then the 99% of laws I think that work. And then there's the governments that do want to change the 1% of laws to improve. And then the other world is and there's a lot of these people that want to say there's a big divide, and that, there's Web3 people that don't want to agree and don't want to abide by the rules and all these laws that governments have built up. And governments will kind of like build them as straight up criminal enterprises, like maybe a Tornado Cash. And the governments want to vilify and kind of bucket, I think, a lot of the Web3 companies into this world. And it's when those governments and Web3 companies that get into conflict, it's kind of a no-win situation for both parties. But actually, I think that most governments just aren't speaking the language of Web3 companies, and they actually do want to help bring this new industry into compliance with existing laws. And that's where we try to kind of be an intermediary, or maybe like Joey, kind of being in that advisory capacity to help both parties understand each other. And so actually, I think like just as payroll and like companies paying taxes, employer taxes is pretty much now standard in every country, you'll see that same standardization. Instead of now like yen or dollars, you're just going to hear it, with now this word called tokens involved. So I think it's actually most people are forward leaning. You just kind of get like right now with this market and environment, you kind of get the scapegoats and headline catching kind of articles, but those are very much, I think, outliers versus the hundreds and thousands of companies and builders that are trying to comply with those laws.
Yeah, it seems like most people in the space are good actors who want to follow the rules, and they're just looking for better rules and for an understanding and a conversation. And I know, Joey, you've been facilitating a lot of conversation, especially in Japan. So what opportunities do you see for the government, especially locally, to play a role in the growth of this ecosystem?
Yeah, so I think there's obviously a lot of opportunity. I think we have to first of all realize that every government is very different, and so I think I was just in Switzerland, and they call taxpayers customers, and Singapore has concierge people for the immigration. In the U.S., there you have customs and border protection officers, and and so that's first of all very different depending on whether you want Web3 entrepreneurs really or not. And then also the law types are different. So you've got common law in the United States and England, where a lot of the law is about figuring out what people are doing in business and then adapting the law as they evolve, whereas the continental law and Japanese law is about trying to figure out every possible problem before it happens and then preventing it, and with minute detail. So they study a lot. And then traditionally, like the Americans had the Boston Tea Party and overthrew the government. It's by the people, for the people, whereas in Japan, it's very much by the authorities, for the people, and very much about protecting people to prevent them from harm. And in the United States, I think it is a lot about being responsible for your own actions. And so that has created a very different environment here. So if you just look historically, we had, interestingly, Mt. Gox was a good thing for Japan because that put Bitcoin on the map and allowed Japan to pass the first sort of digital payment system crypto law that allowed all these exchanges to grow. And then we had CoinCheck, which then caused us to contract. And so around 2017, 2018, we really locked down. And then now we didn't have that growth that the summer that a lot of people had. But I think, when Kishida-san came in last year and said we want a new kind of capitalism, we want to reboot startups, we want to fix the economy, and we want to help local governments. And they really didn't figure out they couldn't figure out after all these study groups exactly what the right idea was. And then Web3 kind of clicked. So at the beginning of this year, we had the digital headquarters NFT paper that really kind of laid out how Web3 would be good and how it could be deregulated. And I think it's the first time that Japan has really been behind this kind of at the prime minister level. And Kishida-san's been going around saying Web3 and NFTs and metaverse everywhere. So now everybody, Keidanren has a task force. All of the government agencies have task force, and they're pretty serious about it, which is really important. I think that so there's an opportunity, I think, in Japan that we have, we don't have as much scarring as the Americans did, because you didn't have this kind of crypto billionaire community that sort of made it look like it was all about the money. And I think that you've got and if you look in the fall last year during the elections, even the opposition parties all ran with a Web3 message. So it wasn't just the ruling party, it's everybody is into this thing. I think as the community, we have to actually now produce. because a lot of people are supportive without really knowing. I think there are politicians that are really supportive of Web3, but it's a small number of people who really understand. And as more and more of the rest of the political layer, as well as the rest of large companies and the rest of the public start to say, okay, well, what's Web3 useful for? You know, can I do it? I think there's a couple things. I think we need to make sure we don't overpromise the short term and not under-deliver on the long term, because that's called Amara's law, which is you always overestimate the short-term impact, underestimate the long-term impact. So it's kind of like tapping the brakes while hitting the accelerator, where you're trying to push the stuff that needs to happen, the long-term design and architecture, but you don't want everybody immediately hoping to try to make a bunch of money. And going back again to the early internet, you know, the beginning at the internet isn't really that useful, but and most of the people making money were people doing events, people who were writing about it, and people who were doing kind of omatsuri, right? And so right now is kind of the omatsuri phase of Web3, and if we do it poorly, people will be disappointed, and then I think it will go down again. So I think it's managing expectations is really important, but I do think that right now we've got, like, there's a whole, we had Kono-san earlier talking, but we had a lot of the politicians that are involved are really good right now, and I think that the bureaucrats that are involved are all, I think, good, and they're all trying to make it happen. So I think it's kind of, in a weird way, us to fumble some of it. Now, I think there's another piece that could happen is there's a lot of laws that have to change, and there's lots in the details. So, and I won't go into the specific details unless we want to, but if you leave a little bit of the, you know, like the sand in the ice cream, whatever metaphor you want, it's still not going to work. And I think the last time around, like the LPA law, there's a lot of little laws that prevent things from happening the last time we tried to reboot startups. But because this is such a big government initiative, I think we have enough political will to get it through. The one thing I'll say, the last thing I'll say is that that tax is one of the big issues. But if you think about the sort of higher level point about tax, the reason or theoretically at least, the reason that capital gains tax is lower is that investing in assets and companies is supposed to help the society, so you're giving people an incentive by providing capital gains tax for investments in certain things. Most people still think that crypto is capital flight and it doesn't help society. That's why we can argue all we want about lowering tax, but unless all of society and the politicians believe that actually investing in crypto is good for society, it's not going to have a wholehearted change. So we can fiddle with the technical things and make certain things better, but what we really need is we need society in Japan to believe that crypto, and actually experience that crypto is good for society. And so I think that focusing on socially beneficial applications, like, you know, carbon or nonprofits or local government governance, I think that's going to go a long way in getting sort of real energy behind it. Because right now it's really kind of just a small number of leadership, and it could easily turn out that, because in Japan they often ask advisors, like yushikisha, and the average advisor, if asked, what do you think about X? If they don't know anything about X, so you go, we should be cautious. And that's what's going to be this next phase, when all these company CEOs and the politicians ask their advisors, and these advisors sort of start sucking air. And then you have to be able to point to what's going on. And so this is sort of the key difficult hurdle now, is to show how we are actually helping.
So I mean, it sounds like part of the grand design for Web3 is figuring out how we over-deliver so that the governments get behind it and support it. I'm curious then, like, how do we over-deliver? Arisa, do you have any take on that?
I mean, I think what Joy mentioned earlier about managing expectations is definitely the key to making sure that we deliver. I also think that really pinpointing towards the right projects is another thing. I think when you look at the way crypto economy has evolved in Japan, we can see that just like in other industries, Japan have really built its own culture at the onset of this industry. And what that also means is in Japan, there has been 14 tokens listed, but some of them, and a lot of them are, you know, very not well-known coins like around the world, but are only really known to Japan specifically. And you know, having this Galapagos culture, even in crypto, I think impedes growth for the future of crypto in Japan. And I think really we want to allow for new projects to be introduced easily and to also be able to close down old projects, which seemingly we haven't really been doing so. And so I think that would definitely be the key.
What sort of opportunities do you all see when it comes to this idea of over-delivering? Like, which spaces should we be exploring? I'm curious, Micah, just to get your thoughts on that.
I really like to think about how blockchain or crypto can actually improve some of the systems we have today when it comes to kind of like what Alyssa said about picking the right projects to focus on. There's a lot that blockchain can do, which is why it's gained so much popularity, but a lot of the big projects aren't really focusing on that. So I think of categories like identity, proof of history. Like if you need to prove where you went to school or your job history, that's something that could be improved through blockchain. I think of financial markets. I think of accessibility and personal freedom of movement. I think, again, security is a big topic within crypto. It's both something that is incredibly secure and something that is not. And so if you think about ways to transfer money, ways to write rules, it can be improved in blockchain. We just have to do it a little bit better. So those are the categories I like to think in. I'll pause there. We're working in security, but I really think that to over deliver, we need to focus on the things that can truly be improved on blockchain and not just something that's fun to do with blockchain, but something that will actually change systems.
When it comes to changing those systems and just integrating them into like the sort of existing systems we already have, which I think is probably part of over delivering. Ken, do you see opportunities to start making government think about how blockchain could become part more deeply of the way that they've already been working?
Yeah, I really do, and I think that, like, for me, in this new kind of like frontier, and I like to think that I'm not very tech savvy, as in like I can't really code, or I'm not on that side of the business, but I like to think that I'm a really good like consumer of like new technologies. But I think that Web3 is still like really hard to use, even for someone that like tries to kind of play around with it every day. And so I think a lot of over delivering and making it easy and compatible with existing systems, just make it easier to use, make it so that you don't have to fumble around and find your keys and connect to a new wallet, or maybe it's a different wallet, and all these different things, and also there's all these different chains as well. If you make it easier to use, I think that that's going to help with a lot of kind of excitement from people, because I think if you think about the Japanese government, for example, like I don't know what the actual average age of someone kind of you're going to be speaking to is, but odds are they probably may or may not still use the flip phone. So it's like that's kind of like, I think, the bar that we need to be able to like deliver to, and for most people. And then once you do that, I think it just becomes a lot easier, more intuitive. I think it was mentioned earlier that NFTs are easy to understand because it's visual, and that's something we understand. But all these different things that you have to do, or maybe if you have to wait for transactions to load and go through, it's all, I think, very, very complicated. So making everything easier, I think. Then one of my favorite things in Japan to kind of like hate on is like the banks are terrible to use. Like you can only go at a certain time from 10 to 3 to go send money overseas. It's like, well, there's a very easy solution for that I think a lot of crypto can actually solve. So, but you have to make it easy.
It seems like the interaction with banks is, especially in Japan, like a really clear sort of opportunity. And it makes me wonder how much of this opportunity is about creating sort of new jobs, new types of work, versus sort of displacing and improving upon the systems that already exist. Joey, do you have any ideas?
Yeah, so I think I was on the New York Times board when we were, downsizing because of digital, and it was interesting because the competitor to the New York Times became less and less other newspapers and CNN and anybody else providing news online, which was not the same as people selling newspapers. And industries can change their business model quite well if they understand technology. So like if you think about video games, they were coin-operated real estate business, and they became a CD physical distribution business, and then they become an online subscription business, and then a digital item business, and now they're like an NFT business. And so I think the thing is really figuring out what business you're in. And I think banks, for example, they provide trust, they could do custody. There's a whole bunch of things that banks can do other than take deposits and loan money, which is kind of what you think of when you think of a banking business. And you see banks like I was just in Switzerland, and you know there's Signum is a bank. It's all cloud. They're crypto native, and they white label for other banks, and they're doing all kinds of really cool things and cool products. And so I think that there are people who can take companies and people who can take their core assets and leverage. Not everyone, but there's a whole set of those, and it's whether they become literate in the technology. And sorry, I'm going to go off a little bit on an older story, but if you look at the history of the Industrial Revolution, so the Industrial Revolution was about mass production of stuff that was originally created by artisans in factories. But if you look at the people who designed the factories, they weren't outsiders coming in. They were actually artisans who connected with the capitalists who knew how to make shoes, but then they figured out how to do it in mass production. And so I think that a lot of people who are in the older industries, either as individual entrepreneurs or some companies, are able to pivot out. Like IBM was, hardware and software and services, and it sort of survived by kind of, it's expensive to switch, but you can switch. So I would say that one thing is that's a category, and obviously there's certain skills that will get de-skilled. I think that the real danger is the market leaving Japan, right? Because now there's a lot more optionality in the jurisdiction you're in, and if Switzerland calls you a customer, rolls out a red carpet, and lets you do all this stuff, at least for certain parts of your business, it becomes less and less feasible to have it in Japan. So I think I'm more worried about the money leaving and the people leaving Japan than I am about certain industries being totally displaced. Because I think particularly old school like manufacturing and supply chain, this is going to take a little longer than NFTs, but once the supply chain is, and again, at the early days of the internet, Netflix didn't exist. It was cheaper to carry a videotape across town than it was to download something, because downloading something on BitTorrent took a whole day. And like that, it's supply chain and manufacturing seems so far away. But if you imagine that we could put in the blockchain every supply chain event, and we could show the provenance of everything. I mean, you could create trading markets, you can do provenance of food. There's so much unlock. And I think that the big Japanese industrial companies can totally get into that, and it's going to take a while. So to me, I think, but if there's no market here, then I think it really, or workers, it really depletes that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to that point, because I think what you mentioned about Industrial Revolution being a combination of artisans with capitalists was hilarious. And I think Web3 is really the combination of traditional banking system coupled with Silicon Valley technologists. And I think where the new markets are really forming is not, it doesn't necessarily need to replace the old system, but I think it really creates accessibility in a way that I mentioned earlier, where financial products, for instance, structured products is where my company builds, and structured products traditionally were only accessible to clients of private banks. And what that means is you had to be at a certain level socioeconomically. You also had to be living in a certain country that was able to create a distribution of these products. And on top of that, when you were purchasing these products, the amount of time it took for the financial settlements to happen, it basically requires you to have the amount of time where you don't necessarily need that capital. What I have seen through the growth of Web3, especially in the decentralized finance space, is a lot of countries who previously may not have had the socioeconomic infrastructure to build banking systems or to build, say, private banking systems that allowed access to certain financial products. These are the people who have really been the first adopters of these new products. And so in a way, I think, it's not necessarily replacing the old system or the old market, but it's creating this market that previously could not access these really high benefit products. And then on top of that, I think it could potentially replace certain parts of the existing system in terms of velocity. So when trading a financial product, for instance, in an investment bank, there are confirmation contracts. These contracts are literal papers, and that needs physical signatures. By having a physical paper, when you are trading with an international entity, you have to ship that paper on either a plane or a boat, and that takes time. But blockchain and smart contracts were able to replace that digitally, and so now all of these transactions can be done in less than a second. And so I think there's definitely value to that. But in kind of the grand scheme of things, the grand design, it could very much just be coexisting as well.
Yeah, I love what you said about the types of products you're building only being available inside private banking before, and it got me thinking about something that Joey said before when we were talking before this, around Web3 being sort of a competition of different good designs. And I think what's fascinating about this space is that for the first time, we're sort of able to build together by default. And the banks are sort of the perfect analogy for that, because if you want to access their products, you have to bank with them, and that usually means a whole suite of things. And so I think what's fascinating about this is the fact that we're sort of accelerating a new type of capitalism where you can just do one thing really well and sort of plug into the whole stack. And I feel like that's something that also Micah's business is like directly related to, which is it might be the type of product you'd expect from something like a bank or like a larger insurance company, but now it's something that you can offer on its own and sort of like win by its own merits. So Micah, I'm curious to get your ideas too around the difference in bundling and unbundling we're seeing in this space.
Yeah, I think it's quite exciting because we're able to bring new opportunities to people who didn't have them before, both from a financial perspective and also just from an international perspective too. Particularly with the products that we're building in, especially in the security space, kind of like how I mentioned before, there's a great opportunity to turn security and the contracts that we have in real life into code. And that relieves a lot of, first of all, paperwork. Second of all, carbon emissions from all the transportation and all these things. But on top of that, it removes this layer of middlemaning and trust that we're all very used to, but something that actually doesn't need to exist anymore, especially because code on chain is visible publicly. That's the best part. There is no hidden agenda. There is no backdoor with this code that is visible to every party involved. And that's something that we should leverage further as we go down the line. And I think many different projects are building very well utilizing smart contracts, but as we see, security is of the utmost importance. So we will tread carefully moving forward.
Yeah, it seems like security is one of those things that people study up on, but they really learn the lesson the first time they get hacked, and they lose their sort of assets in this space. So I'm wondering, Ken, I mean, you're dealing with people who are getting paid in tokens, so you must think about this a lot. Is there a way to educate people and get them to learn the lessons before they lose their assets?
I think it depends on the person. It might be a cop-out answer, but I was the kind of kid when my parents told me, "Hey, the stove is hot," I'd put my hand on the stove and actually check if it was hot. Others, will actually listen and just be like, "Oh, okay, like let's not do that." But I think what's happening and what we talked about before is that Japan's in an interesting place because it doesn't have this negative stigma of crypto. So I think people will be a lot more willing to kind of just learn and say, okay, here's this interesting new thing, and here are some pros of it, and here are some cons, as in like you want to make sure that not your key, not your wallet, or I'm sorry, not your tokens. And so just understanding what it means to actually own your own and have your own custody of your tokens versus in the US, I think there's already been sort of like a stigma, crypto equals bad. I don't want to learn. It's hard. It's difficult. Someone knows someone, that got hacked, and it doesn't really matter because, these hackers have really, really, really big incentives to actually go after you. So even if you take the biggest of precautions, you might still be at risk. And so I think there's kind of like a range, but I think generally as maybe products like what Micah's company offers, it just makes it easier for people to be able to actually learn about things and actually feel safer. So I think it's like a point in time thing where right now we're kind of in this middle ground. market's down, people have, a bad taste in their mouth. But I think as people build newer, better, easier products to use, people are going to be more willing to kind of learn and get to understand what exactly are people doing. I mean, it goes back to the paper examples we were using. I think stocks used to be like, you used to have like bearer bonds where you actually had to, own the piece of paper to say it was yours. But, we've had a lot of innovation since then to make it a lot easier to own different types of assets.
And say we all over deliver and we get everybody excited about building in this space. What advice do you have for them, Arisa?
Good question. I think definitely right now is a fantastic time to build because there are just an incredible amount of opportunities in this space. I think what I see happening in the near future is that, I think regulation-wise, there's going to be a lot more structure, and everything else is going to be bigger. So there's going to be a lot more users in the space. There's going to be a lot more products in the space and services as well. And so what that means is, I think the opportunities are going to become harder to grab. I think socially, there are probably going to be communities that form that are going to be harder to get into. But right now in crypto, if you want to, meet anyone, any influencer or anyone building, it's just very, very accessible. And I think the treasure of information that is available to you right now when you're in the Web3 community is phenomenal. And it's life-changing. I think technology-wise, there's a lot of new technology being created right now, but we still haven't figured out the best practice of, what kind of chain composition makes sense, or, should we go cross-chain or should we go multi-chain? Should we use sharding? Like, I think all these technological experimentations are being done right now, and if you're a part of the contributor, it's really going to it's really going to be the foundation and the infrastructure of what the next entire world's goods and services will be built upon. So it's really rewarding. And so, I think for anyone considering being in the space, I would say doing it right now would be my number one advice.
Yeah, it seems like it's a great time to be building, especially without there's a lot less noise in this space now. And you're seeing the people who are left really believe in the technology and the values and the opportunity behind it. So I think it's actually a really great time. I'm going to do one more question before we go to Q&A. I just wanted to ask Joey, since he's helping a lot of people that are new to this space, like how do you help them get started?
I think, first of all, I agree with Arisa and you that you need to start right away, even though I would say you're not going to immediately start making money from it. You have to start now because the infrastructure decisions are kind of long-term, but also there's an intuition that I still remember when I was explaining the web to people who had never used the web. And it was like, so there's software on my computer and it opens a window that reads HTML, this is a protocol, and then there's a thing called a URL, which is a uniform record locator, and then there's this protocol like a domain name, and it goes, you could never imagine like just browsing Yahoo, but you do Yahoo back in the early days for 2 minutes, and you immediately get a mental model of how it works. It's the same. You create a wallet, buy an NFT, onboard some money, and this thing takes 2 seconds, this thing takes 10 seconds. Oh, wow, this costs $30. Those are intuitive things that you get about Web3 that you never get if you don't try it. So I think just trying it personally, but also doing an experiment in your company is really important. And then the other thing I'd say, just in general, as we start to hear Japanese regulator, this is sort of a meta important point, is my old buddy Gary Gensler is like slamming on the brakes in the US right now. But 80% of my investments are Americans. The American sort of ecosystem around, and Kathy was talking earlier about 100x more venture capital money. America is just exploding with Web3 innovation, and they're pouring water on it to try to cool it down, which is very different from Japan, which is frozen. And if you try to freeze it even more, it's bad. And there are people who are going to say, inevitably, well, America's slamming on the brakes. We can't get ahead of our skis. Let's wait for the Americans to figure it out. They're in a completely different situation where they can afford to slam on the brakes, sort of. I mean, I think they're still at risk, but Japan can't. And Japan likes to slam on brakes. So I think it's really important that we don't sort of look at the Americans' caution as a way to think about Japan. It's a completely different thing. And I think for companies as well, it's an opportunity for Japan to get kind of at a, and I also don't think that Japan's going to become number one. I think we're going to get a seat at the table. And I also think that it's important not to overstate where Japan is. Japan's really far behind, and we may catch up a little bit. But I think we can do that. But a lot of this will be industry actually being serious about it. I mean, we've got the stablecoin law came out earlier than they did in the United States. We've got banks getting excited, and I think encouraging the big companies to take it seriously and start building the infrastructure so that startups can start working with this infrastructure. So I do think that the banking experience is kind of crappy, but instead of like scaring them, I think that trying to help them create a platform for startups to work with, you know, because they've got customers, they've got lots of infrastructure that they can use, and so I'd encourage startups also to work with the big companies. I mean, yeah, the fact that Keidanren has a task force that's roughly positive on this stuff is pretty amazing. I think it's a cool thing.
Great. So let's jump into questions. Do you have any questions in the audience?
Thank you for the great information. My question is like, I'm Suhas Barmas. I am a student of Globis. I am working 17 years in IT industry and mostly the web technology. The question is about blockchain technology. I think it's 10-year-old now. Still, we don't think it's a mainstream technology. There are many problems like political wish or business. Many corporates are not going for the blockchain technology. How do you see the future of blockchain technology? One of the panelists mentioned, like after 10 years. So, do you really think that the complete landscape is going to change using blockchain technology? And if you compare that with the other technologies like artificial intelligence, which changes the user experience. It's a functional, it takes care of functional requirement. Blockchain technology takes care of non-functional aspect. So how do you see the future of blockchain technology? Would we be able to see the full-fledged applications in blockchain technology? That's the question.
Does anybody want to take this one?
Sure, I can try to answer that question. It was a very grand question for the topic of grand design. I think that blockchain technology does have a lot of real world application. I think right now we don't see much because we're still in the experimentation phase and the industry itself is still very nascent. I think example I brought up earlier, even in a large company, is that, for instance, smart contracts. It's a type of digital contract that not only validates that the transaction happened at a certain time, that is very transparent, everyone else can see it, and it can never be replaced. You can also do things like financial settlements that are automated, and so it instantly creates like trust between two different entities. And I think that that requirement for trust is very much emphasized in a P2P transaction where it's an individual versus an individual. But I actually like to argue that it is also a very big potential for institutions versus institutions, because so much of the news we see day to day are like intercorporation issues with financial settlements. A good example is Elon deciding that he was not going to buy Twitter all of a sudden, and now having to go into a lawsuit. This would not happen if the discussion between Twitter and Elon was done over a smart contract. And so in that way, I think there are applications in large scale companies, but people are still experimenting, and I think we are going to be able to see the results of these experiments in probably like 5 years or so.
Can I just do one metaphor? So I still remember when I was trying to get people to use email, and they were saying, well, what can you do on email that you can't do on fax? I'm like, well, but once it becomes ubiquitous, but it's not. No one else uses email, and it's very similar. It does a lot of things right now that are easier to do in other ways. But when you imagine what happens when the cost and the speed goes down, and instead of having a little tiny Raspberry Pi-sized virtual machine on the blockchain, it's like a database that's accessible to anybody, that is publicly funded, in that it's not owned by anybody. And that's a really important part, is that you pay your gas, and no one owns the computer in which the record is. It's a public cloud, right? And so that unlocks a bunch, and you try to imagine what has had more impact on your life, the internet or AI? And AI is older, right? AI's been around for a long time. And so I think that the idea of standardization and a sort of ubiquitous system in which you can do a whole set of kind of generic functions that will unlock whole new things, I think that will have impact, but it's hard to prove it. But I've been experiencing the internet since the 80s, and it's always sort of out delivered what people were expecting. And I think AI will be a key part, by the way, so because I think that blockchain creates this intense transparency, but transparency is not useful unless you can ask questions against it. And I think it's going to be the role of probabilistic computing and models and inference to be able to then take that transparency and to be able to ask in natural language, well, what's the most unusual thing that happened in Congress today? Oh, interesting. Well, how is that person connected to this person? That will be available when you add AI with blockchain.
Take another question.
Hi, my name is Yusuke Matsuda. I'm country manager for Crimson Global Academy, an international high school here in Japan. Very got inspired to think of how I can put my online school on the Web3. This question might be for Joy-san. Do you have any advice for educators on how we can empower, equip the next generation to be passive, not active participants in the Web3 rather than passive victims? What kind of skill sets, knowledge should we equip with our children?
So I think there's just two, I'll be short because we don't have a lot of time, but one thing that's interesting about DAOs and Web3 is that you can start a group and have a structured sort of entrepreneurial experience as a 5-year-old. And we used to do this on online games where like elementary school kids had guilds and stuff like that, but in Japan in particular, but globally, kids learning how to be responsible, how to organize, how to sort of think in structure. I think that's very useful, and Web3 is a good space for that. And you can do it either directly or there are a lot of Web3 educational products coming out. I think the other thing that's key for me is micro-certification. So we just did the Chiba Institute of Technology where I am. We created a certification that you can check on the blockchain. And because we put it out as an NFT, we didn't have to that's my point about the blockchain. We didn't have to ask anybody for permission. We didn't have to go to some Japanese government agency. We didn't have to create a consortium because no one owns it. We just put it on the blockchain. And now anybody can do it. So your school, I can teach you this afternoon, and you can start issuing credentials that are verifiable using the World Wide Web Consortium's verifiable credentials, because it's all about open standards. So what I would like to see with education, both formal as well as informal, is a massive credentialing system that allows people to show what they've done, what they've learned in a global way, and come up with a way for people to both award them, but also interpret them. So when you're hiring, you can start to see that. And I think the credentialing is really kind of, the credentialing and also the interpretation of that credentialing is a really bad artifact of this kind of very hierarchical educational system. And so I think thinking about how, and then talking with your communities, but just doing it, I think it's important to just start, and you can start right away.
Do we have any questions online? No? Okay. We have somebody back there.
Hello, my name's Eric, and I'm an MBA student, and I'm originally from Australia, actually. You might have heard Optus was recently hacked, one of the biggest Australian hacks. How would you consider this situation in this new world of Web3? Like, how do we protect people's identities and prevent these kind of situations happening again?
This seems like a good question for Micah.
I wish I had a perfect answer for you. I think blockchain in particular, we've all probably heard of the Binance hack that happened just like a couple days ago. There's hacks within bridge protocols, there's hacks within individual wallets, there's hacks all over the place. I think as there's a push to tie wallets to real identities, we're going to be coming to this concentric circle of space where we have the same kind of identity protection issues that we have in traditional Web 2. Right now, we're in the space where not all wallet identities or addresses can be tied to real world identities and addresses, which is part, again, of the decentralization and the pseudonym and antonym like identity in crypto and blockchain. So I think there's two worlds here. I think one world is that everyone's forced to tie individual identity to wallet addresses on chain, and then you run into the same problems as before. Or you have the other path where it's not tied to your identity. And in this sense, individual identity, your history may be visible, but you can't exactly tie that to one person or another. So I think there's a couple different routes to go to, but there is a brighter future in my mind.
think we have time for one or two more questions. Okay. Well, well, look, I learned a lot. This was really good. I mean, I think we covered a lot of topics on this today, and we have like a very broad set of things people are working on. So lots of interesting viewpoints. And I think going deep in this space is sort of the thing that's always been exciting to me. Like the more I go, the more I see. I think there's a term that we like to use in Web3, like you go down the rabbit hole. And I think for any of you who haven't done it yet, you should try it because it really does go very deep.
There's a really good Web3 education protocol called Rabbit Hole. So for anyone trying to learn about Web3 for the first time, you can go on rabbithole.gg and try out a bunch of different protocols. You can earn tokens as rewards when you do learn these different things. I have no association with this protocol, but I just recommend it.
And just to reiterate one thing that we said earlier, and Arisa said it, but is right now it's still not so crowded that you can actually meet everyone in the space. And there's information, but if you run as fast as you can catch the train. Like and I'm creating FOMO, but 6 months or a year from now, you won't catch the train. You'll be paddling behind the wave, and you'll be a reasonable consumer, but you won't be a leader. But I think especially for entrepreneurs, but any company that wants to get ahead of the wave, you got to start paddling now. Like I've been going 150% for the last year or so, and just caught up. And I think that it's important, and I think it's important for Japan, but I think it's important for individuals to not wait until it gets a little bit easier, because then you're going to be a follower. And I think it's okay for there to be most of the people are followers, but I assume the people who are here are kind of in the leadership seats. So I would suggest you and your at least a small group of your people are trying to get ahead of the wave.
Yeah, it seems like a great place to end it. So yeah, this is exciting. Thank you everybody for the conversation.